Welcome to the Rodcast with Rod Turner, the show all about real estate. We discuss everything that affects asset-backed businesses, investments, and go deep into the details with some of the best in the business.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Rodcast. Today my guest has 36 years experience in the construction industry, with the last 2 decades focusing on residential property and the last 16 of those years focusing on affordable housing. His developments have achieved 4 RIBA awards, 5 Evening Standard awards, the RICS Award and the Royal Fine Arts Commission Trust Award. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Pieter Zitman to the Rodcast. Welcome, Pieter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So, Pieter, I've given a very, very brief bit of information about what it is that you've done there, but can you give us a bit more background as to how you got involved into the property sector and ended up focusing on affordable housing?
Quite through an odd route. I trained as an architect, and having qualified, it was quite a while back, and the economy wasn't great, so bouncing between jobs. And I'd been working with a company that allowed me to study part-time to do my degrees, and I was working with a guy who then went on to study estate development, and he gave me a call and said, would you like to come and work on estates in the university sector? And I thought, sounds like fun. Then I met our Vice-Chancellor, who told us that he wanted us to get to the best quality design we could achieve, which is music to any architect's ears. And so we employed some of the best architects in the world at the time, Daniel Libeskind, Zaha Hadid. We had a great time. Then I went back to doing architecture and project management. And I was doing quite large architectural developments, blocks of flats. And for most of them, the affordable housing was parked to the worst part of the site, and you glorified all the open market. And I was getting quite disenchanted with this. I thought this is not the right way to do it as an architect, or even just ethically. And I was invited to join Pocket Living, and they just started up. They got planning permission for the first 3 schemes, and they needed somebody to deliver them. They didn't really know how to do that, so I said, well, that sounds like fun too. I'll go and do that as well. And stayed with them for almost 7 years, developing everything out for them, from employers' requirements, etc. And they were doing affordable intermediate housing. And that's really what piqued my interest, was how do you create affordable housing at a good quality and standard? And that's really how I got into it, and then wanted to go. Obviously, you start at one point and you just want to go as far as you can.
And so how do you define affordable housing then?
That's really interesting, because this came out of a lot of negotiation with the GLA and others, and it's effectively, it's a home that can be afforded on 40% of net income. And that's where it really becomes interesting, because all housing should be affordable, frankly. There should be no differentiation, because it doesn't matter whether you earn £1 million a year or £20,000 a year. It should still be affordable to you.
And how do you find affordability?
Well, through that 40% of net income. Because the real difficulty is that with the housing problems that we have today, people are spending well over that 40%, and that in itself is not such a problem until you start to look at what the effects of that are, which ends up as people not being able to progress their lives, whether that's having a family, their careers, moving for jobs. So it affects a huge range of areas. So the country's economy gets affected, because if you don't have people with good skills able to move to where the jobs are, then it negatively affects the economy.
And obviously it's going to be subjective on a personal level, because one person's income will be different to the next person's income, and a lot of that's affected by different areas as well, isn't it? I mean, how have you seen different areas affected by affordable housing or lack of?
Well, I think the biggest problem is that we are going through, as human beings, we go through the greatest level of urbanization that we've ever done in our history as humans. And people are obviously then moving to where the jobs are. And that's principally cities. and we just haven't been able to build enough homes to suit the changing demographics. So there are a lot more single people now than there used to be, smaller families, and this is a global trend. It's not just England or
and we live longer.
Britain. And we live longer,
We
yes.
live longer,
And from that comes other conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to provide those sorts of homes in an industry that is very slow moving, it does, as you know, take at least 2 years to realise a project. And a lot happens in 2 years, economically, politically, etc. So for me, I think that it's coming to terms with the demands of what's happening to the country, whether it's through migration, whether it's through migration within the country. So
Household formation.
yes, and people moving from smaller little towns where their job prospects are less, and they're moving into cities. That is also migration of people around the country and moving to interesting sectors. You know, the band that forms Milton Keynes, Oxford, Cambridge. There's a huge growth in sciences and industry there, and trying to catch up with the demand of that, of getting people into those industries is a problem, as much as it is for London or Manchester or Newcastle or wherever it is.
So we hear all the time about the housing crisis in the UK. What do you see as the main problems with housing in the UK?
That, again, is a complex question. None of these have easy answers. Which you alluded to earlier, which is people living longer, is part of an issue that needs addressing. We haven't built enough homes historically, and we haven't built those homes for a changing demographics. And the real difficulty is that we've had land prices escalate at a phenomenal rate, and over the last 15 years, construction costs go up as much. And that's created a real problem. So a small number of older people have property wealth, but it's not real wealth because they can't realise it because it's their homes.
Yeah.
And so how do you address this change with these costs? And on top of that, we've got young people not earning what their parents and grandparents had. They've got educational costs on them. And the salaries, the housing, everything is going against them. So we are in a real problem.
And when you say young people don't earn what the older generation earn, I'm guessing it's obviously not nominal, but it's looking at, well, what's their disposable income after, say, housing costs that they can go and spend on, I don't know, food, clothes, travel, discretionary spending and things like that.
And the value, the relative value of homes relative to those salaries has changed exponentially. And it's very difficult for somebody, if you said 20 years ago somebody else on a £35,000 salary, you think, wow, they're earning a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's not anymore.
Yeah.
And the value of property then was so much lower relatively.
And so what would you see as what would you see as any fixes to this?
We have to build a lot of homes. There are people with second homes, and I don't begrudge that. That's fine for them, and they rent them out. I think it's easy to point to those sorts of things and say there's the problem, but it isn't. We just haven't built enough homes. We haven't built the right homes. And as we've realised there's a climate crisis upon us, we aren't building the right kinds of homes to deal with those issues. Even with retrofit that's happening, it's across council estates all over of England, introducing double glazing into a 1970s home is a good thing on one level, but it's also a terrible thing on another level because all that heat gain isn't mitigated through passive solar control. And so you're building in problems, and because they're so much more insulated from a air exchange position, you're getting mold developing. One has to be very careful as to what one does when introducing new measures to deal with these things.
I'm so glad you mentioned mold, because I think this is one of the biggest issues we come up when renting properties, because we're not in control of how someone lives within a property. And so there's two elements. There's the fabric of the building and how airflow moves across what are very old buildings, hundreds of years old. And then the other point is how people live within them. And you're trying to kind of marry the two to ensure that whoever's in there has, two things that we want is, one, for them to make sure the property is in a good condition, and two, that they pay the rent.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for that to happen when those two things don't marry up. In terms of the fabric of the building and how someone lives, and mould is just an enormous problem in this country.
It is.
Caused predominantly by condensation.
Yes, and we all carry black mould on us.
Yeah.
It's prevalent everywhere, but the reason it doesn't take hold in certain areas is because the ventilation's correct and the dew points are correct, and the buildings are designed, particularly passive house, to ensure that those things don't happen. But the difficulty is when we try and introduce the insulation and change that dew point and then cut off the air circulation, it's not necessarily somebody's lifestyle. It's the fact that we've changed the fabric of the building has changed what happens within it. And it's about realising that and saying, well, our building's also a lot more complex. If you look at a modern flat today, you get ended up with a massive booklet on how to run the home, because it is such a complex entity now. And getting people to understand what the implications are, particularly in bathrooms and kitchens, of having a lot of steam and that you have to vent it, because it is part of the modern fabric.
So you mentioned we've got to build a lot more homes, and we've got these big house builders who are seemingly the only ones building homes, because it doesn't seem to be a lot of the SME market, it doesn't seem to be a lot of local authorities. Housing associations are building a small amount, but not much. Is there an issue of those house builders not building affordable homes and just building at the top end of the market? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And if we do need more affordable homes, how do we build more affordable homes?
And that, again, is really interesting, because what's happened with a lot of the housing associations is that they became developers, and then to be able to deliver the homes that they're trying to deliver, they became open market developers and moved away from the models of providing purely affordable homes. And therein lies the rub, is that the costs go up and they are having to then reduce the amount of affordable homes to make the whole thing stack up and get their profit lines that they needed to make it commercially viable. I think that the lesson learnt was actually in the 40s and 50s, when affordable housing was nationalised. And it wasn't nationalised just for people on lower incomes, it was nationalised for everybody. So doctors, lawyers, nurses, tradespeople were all offered affordable homes. And my view is, because those big companies are finding it very difficult to deliver the quantity of homes, and they've also got retrospective issues they have to deal with, we need some element of nationalisation of affordable homes to just bring in the numbers. And
does that look like from a local authority point of view, or from a more of a national government point of view?
I think they both have to work hand in hand.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be within local councils and entities, because they have the land for a start, and they've got the capacity. What they need to do is be supported in delivering not just the homes, but good quality homes, not just through having the right people in the house to be able to deliver them, but understand the mechanisms and requirements of then managing them afterwards.
Because and the management is a great point that I think people forget about. But kind of going back one step, if it is local authorities building these, there's two big elements, and the first one is cost. Where does the money come from in order to do this? And the second is who's going to build them? Where does the labour force come from? And I think that they're elements within building any types of homes, really, en masse, but especially if it is local authority. I mean, what are your thoughts on, number one, the cost? I mean, we've started coming into a new period of higher interest rates and things like that. Before we started recording, we have a very brief kind of moan about kind of Michael Gove and the billions of pounds that had to be handed back because they weren't spent. Is there some sort of bond that the government can create to do this? What are your thoughts with that?
I think the way that housing needs to be delivered is on a number of scales. I think everybody needs to play a hand in it. It's not just about saying the local councils will solve this, because they can't, and neither could the large developers, and neither can the SMEs. But we all need to play a part in it, and the government has the funds, because when you do that level of affordable housing, you can take a long-term pragmatic view of it and deliver stuff that you're not going to expect an immediate return from. but not do what we need to do is learn the lessons of the past and not just deliver social rents. I don't particularly like the term, but we need to have a lot of those homes, but we can't have 100% in one development block.
You can't ghettoise locations.
No, yes, and you get better, richer communities by having a range of people living in them, whether it's families with single people, older people, whether it's open markets, intermediate housing and affordable housing. We need to have the range in any of the developments, and it also makes it stack up a lot more easily for councils because they can get the returns.
Absolutely. And I think the key thing you said there was a long-term outlook, which politically doesn't seem to happen much in this country, does it?
I don't think it happens anywhere because
China, maybe.
Well, perhaps,
for all its bad things, maybe
but
it
that's
does
crashed monumentally.
Of course.
Yes, it is difficult because it has to take a pragmatic view of when the next election is going to come up. But if you've got a strong mandate, as the Labour Party do it right now, where you can quite easily see it at least at two-term, you can take those views and put in the mechanisms so actually we can deliver this stuff over this long period of time rather than rush into it and say, yes, we can do these, but the payback will be 10, 20 years.
I totally agree on the long term and the payback. What do you think's stopping it from happening at the moment?
I think there's the will to do it. I think the Labour Party have the will. I think that it'll take them a little while to put it into practice. The murmurings coming out of the Labour Party seem to be the right things about how to deliver them and what needs to be done. And what you alluded to earlier, which is who's going to build them and how. I think off-site construction is a route, and it's easy to forget that actually most of construction is off-site. Bricks aren't made on-site.
Yeah.
All this sort of stuff is ready most of the way there. We just need to extend that. So it's actually not difficult to do. You don't have to become quite radicalized in terms of the construction methods, because the systems, whether it's lightweight steel structures, cross-laminated timber, they're all very good systems. They a little bit more dear, but they bring huge benefits.
But you still need the labour. Whether it's off-site or on-site, there's still labour involved wherever it is in doing that. And where's that labour coming from at the moment? Because we don't seem to have that.
Well, a lot of that labour went home during the COVID crisis. But I think if the market is and the industry is seen in a more positive light and shown to be in a more positive light, I think people will be attracted to it because the salaries aren't bad in the construction industry.
Salaries are pretty good, I think.
With a particular skilled trades, people, plumbers, electricians, etc.
But we seem to have we seem to have a problem at the moment in the UK, where I think we've got 500,000 skilled labour that is leaving the market due to retirement age. So they're getting to that age and from the grassroots up. So we're not getting anyone to come in and fill those places. So is it a case of attracting people at grassroots, or is it a case of attracting people from elsewhere that are already skilled, or is it a bit of both?
It's a bit of both.
Yeah.
There was a lot of money put together by developers to train people up in apprenticeships, and that just hasn't been realised. We need to go back and market those opportunities within schools and show what a great career it is in construction, because you leave a legacy, an amazing legacy in construction, and it's a great career. And
it needs a new PR team, doesn't it, to make it sexy or Instagrammable maybe for younger people, because it does seem that, I know when we deal with plumbers, we know how much they earn. They earn good money, and it just seems mad to me that people aren't kind of flooding into that industry. So going back to the cost, then you mentioned the government has the money. What's stopping them from going, right, here you go, here's all the money, local authorities, let's get to it? Because is that going to be a problem within our economy, that actually it's already a government that's heavily in debt? How does that look at it? I know we've talked about a long-term payback, but is that something that they've just got to go ahead and crack on with?
The quick answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think it's you can't just throw money at these things. There will be a lead in time of getting the skills, getting councils geared up to deliver changes in planning. All these sorts of things need to get into place and draw the staff in. you go back sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago, and all the best architects were working for local councils, and there's a real pride. And I think we don't necessarily have to go back to that state, but I think there could be a better working together, an openness to work together to achieve, rather than a them and us situation.
So why do you think that's changed over time? Has it been that people in the private sector get paid more, and that's what's attracted people out of the public sector, maybe, or why is talent not staying in the public sector?
It's part of that, I think. Yes, the salaries are better, the opportunities are better, and councils just aren't geared and haven't been geared to do this sort of work because there's been a tapering for a long time not to produce housing, and they haven't had the incentives to do it. And so people just went out into the open market and followed the market.
People act as they're incentivised.
Yeah, and people are now being attracted back into residential sector particularly, and that's exciting. And I think that people are starting to see that there's a great opportunity in it, and to deliver those homes.
And you mentioned there the planning system. So, one, do you think the planning system is a barrier at the moment? And two, how do we fix it?
No, I think the planning system's been a barrier for a long time, a heck of a long time, and it's stifled development on all sectors because it's become a them and us, partly, and I think it's also to do with not having a long-term view and not a proper long-term plan, not just within a parliamentary cycle, but a 20, 30, 50-year plan of what do we have to do for the country to get us into the strongest position, whether it's in housing or industry. And if we had that collective work towards that, then we would have a long-term plan to understand how to deliver that. And we need to work with those colleagues because they work incredibly hard in planning departments, and they're
overworked, and that's half of the problem. I mean, when you get the average planning application is, I can't remember how many thousands of pages after all the documents, and the planning fee to put it in is normally about £1,000 or something, and it's just, how on earth does people have the time to do that? It's not an efficient method at the moment.
And the means to get planning is not great either. To be spending more on brickwork than on planning than you on
absolutely
is nuts.
Yeah.
And the expectation is that you have to go through the entire cycle to the point of getting all your applications in before you granted anything, which means the upfront cost and risk to the developer, particularly SMEs, is enormous. And we need to change the way that works, because funding comes with certainty. And if we can have a system where there could be, much like they have in New York, if I do X, Y, and Z, we'll grant you planning. We'll sort out the rest later on.
Almost like permitted development.
Yes.
It's like making more things, giving more surety to certain outcomes, isn't it? Because, you're absolutely right. As an SME developer myself, we will not go ahead with building out lots of things or going for schemes purely because of the risk and cost of planning.
And you won't get the funding either.
So we just don't do it. We miss out on a huge amount of sites because of that, and they just don't end up getting built. And that's crazy, because you go back to the 50s and the 60s, SMEs actually made up a much bigger proportion of what's being built, as did local authorities then. And you look at now, and it's really only the big house builders that are the people building.
Yeah.
So something needs to be done to motivate people like us to actually go and build. And what is it you think that is, apart from opening up the planning system and maybe making it more efficient? I mean, is there anything else that can be done there?
I think the long-term planning, looking at, and the Labour Party are talking about pushing councils to come up with robust plans for development, and to look at that. I mean, they did this in Melbourne in Australia, where they really looked at the city and said, how are we going to increase the number of density here for the number of people, for the people that we need to do. And they came up with a robust plan of saying, along these primary transport routes, we're going to allow development up to certain scales. And then as a developer, if I go up to that scale, I'm fine.
Yeah.
As long as I've got the right tenure. And you can say, look, this is what I'm intending to do. And the council will say, great, you can do that. We'll sort out the aesthetics and the Section 106 and all that stuff in due course. But at least you can then bring in funding to say, look, I've got a surety that we can do this development. We just need to work out the detail, and whether it's contamination reports or whatever it is, we can do that in due course. And we need to work together to work out these plans and get those development rights, because there's actually a lot of land, if you look at primary transport routes, particularly in London, where there's fantastic development opportunities. And if there's has to be compulsory purchase orders or whatever it is to get that stuff going, then perhaps that's what has to happen.
We lost an appeal recently on one that's been derelict for 15 years, and the council wanted it, and then suddenly adopted a new emerging plan, and everything changed, and we now have to prove marketing that no one wants it as industrial for 18 months and things like that. So,
I do understand why those rules exist within the planning system, because you don't want to end things, but it needs to be a balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to take a quick break and hear from our sponsor. Okay, so you just mentioned Section 106s, and we've heard recently in the news that a lot of housing associations, registered providers, are no longer, or where they used to be, buying the Section 106 off the big developers to build out. Those transactions are really dwindling, and it's come out in the press that that's due to some of these housing associations having to spend money on existing stock and not being able to afford to do that, and that's having a big effect on building starts. Have you got any thoughts on that? Do you think that's the reality? Do you think there's a fix to this problem? Because obviously, if it sounds as though the affordable element of development is holding up all development, what are your thoughts?
It's been a problem for a while. I looked at a site in E1 where it was 140 units, and I couldn't find anybody to take on the affordable elements of it. It was just too small for them, and they wanted too much out of it. I think there are ways of looking at it, and I think it'll need us to reset the dial on how we see and perceive affordable housing. That it isn't just social rent. Mm-hmm. There are lots of other forms of affordable housing, and that would allow developers to move ahead and say we may not be doing affordable rent because that comes with all sorts of other restrictions, but we're going to provide another type of affordable housing, the intermediate form of housing. And there's a lot of models, whether it's rental, sale, discounted sales, etc. And those are easy to monitor, and they don't require the structures that particularly the current social rents need. And I think if we can just loosen that up a bit, because I don't think these issues are going to go away.
No, and I mean, again, from an SME point of view, a lot of the sites, I mean, typically in the past it was anything over 9 units, but lots of councils have taken that away now. So we did a 5-unit scheme that had a Section 106 element to it and things like that. So, but that's very prohibitive against development. So what tends to end up happening is those things don't get built out because there's the land price or the price at which the landowner's trying to sell. There's the amount that the developer can buy it for. And I know people might think, well, landowner needs to come to reality and not do it. But sometimes if they sell too low, they'll be out of pocket. So they can't sell because then they'll be underwater. So it's a bit of a tricky situation to work out. And if it's a case of changing how affordable is done, how would you propose that works? I mean,
I think there are ways of doing it, and again, it's complex problems to solve. If we're looking at, say, a particular site, what a lot of SMEs will do is they'll say, well, I get below the threshold or up to the threshold, and I just say some of them aren't there. And looking at whatever the contribution would be as social rents. And actually, if you say, I'm going to do a lot more. So I looked at a site where an open market developer would be below the threshold, 7-9 units. I put on 18 units onto the site with 50% affordable and made up the land value. because I didn't go for a social rented affordable model. I went for a fixed shared equity model, which allowed me to then work out the maths of how to make sure that the whole thing stacks up and get the land value and the profit line, etc. And it just gives you another way of delivering still affordable, very much affordable, and very much needed affordable homes. It's just a different type.
And so when we kind of went back at the start and to define affordable, are there different ways then in which you can define that? You mentioned the shared equity route. Are there any other things that you think local authorities need to kind of put into that affordable bracket?
Well, I think they're all there already. They are agreed in one form or another, either by the GLA or Homes England have agreed a lot of the models. It's about getting them out there and getting more people to understand them, whether it's with whether there's pre-approved documents that says this is how this model works and this is how you manage it. Because it's not that complex to work out how these things work. So the model I came up with, which was a tiered fixed shared equity model. So you start with tier 1, which says, for example, a recently qualified nurse on a salary of £30,000 in London, with London waiting, what can they buy? And so you work backwards on the maths and say, how much rent, how much mortgage can you afford? And then you sell the proportion of the flat that then links to that. Then you have tier 2, tier 3, as it goes up, whatever increments that you feel works for your model. So you start with 30,000, then maybe it's 40,000, 50,000, then open market. And it allows you to change the way that the development model graph works. So when you're doing an ordinary standard development, when you do your social rent, you lose money on the units that you're selling off. And that's quite a big dip because there's a chunk of cash.
Because it still costs you money to build them.
And then you have to make it up on the open market. When you do a fixed shared equity model where it's graded like that, your dip is just a little less. And your graph, you still get to the same point, but your graph just goes up more slowly. But it means you can
evens out the volatility, I guess. And
there's a huge demand for these homes because people, they aren't there. So we do need to develop them, all types of them. But if we can open these models and say, look, here, this is how this works, and give them to the SME developers and say, this is how you do it. And you go, okay, I can do that. I know what that cost parameter is. It's a lot of spreadsheet work, but you can work it out. You get to the right point.
Because obviously the difficulty is always, it's not just about the sale costs, it's or rental costs, whatever it's going to be, or value at the end. It's about how much it costs you to come up with that product, isn't it? And to build anything, there's going to be a minimal cost to it. So, and that's really where I'm finding the difficulty, in that the build costs have gone up so much because the materials actually aren't too bad. They've come down a bit, but it's the labour, and it's finding that right labour to get in, and it is really, really difficult. And so that's more what is really holding it up, because if we can't build to that level, then we don't want those units obviously to be done. And then it's kind of a battle of, right, are you then building out those affordable units, or are you paying a Section 106 to the local authority to put into, I don't know, other forms of affordable housing, which is really tricky.
Yeah, and it is difficult because we are living in a time of overinflated land values, and this, as you said earlier, that's where a big part of the problem is that land values are so overinflated that to be able to do the developments, actually they're stopping, because you can work out the construction costs, you can work out the sales costs and all the other elements, but you up against a wall of land value. I think it's easy to look at planning as a problem, but actually there are other problems which we need to solve, and that is land. And if we want to deliver that affordable housing, then maybe we need to look at that element and say to councils, well, or the government, if you want to deliver these, then you're going to have to change the land value through some mechanism, whatever that is. I'm not an expert in that, but there must be a way of changing that land value to ensure that you get the affordable housing and at the densities that you require. Well,
I guess it goes back to what you said before. The quickest route to that is looking at the government and local authority owned land and starting there, because it's already under ownership, and again looking at that long-term view. And even if payback is 20 years in the future, that's still something that's going to be a benefit 20 years later than if you don't build it out. So I do think that side of things is really important. Where you do it from the private sector, again, it comes down to what's happening in the markets where, I don't know, if people have bought some land as part, or I don't know, own a plot of land as part of their pension, it's again working that out. How does it all come about? And I'm not sure how that works really. It's a hard one.
Yeah, it is a very difficult one, and I think there's an element of looking at what real land value is, and rather than saying, look, if a developer develops this out, you're going to get 5 million for your plot of land, and being somewhat more reasonable, say, understand the costs and the mechanism to actually work out what that land value is, because otherwise it just doesn't. You can have it in your pension pot, but if no one buys it, it's worthless. There needs to be a rationalisation on it.
No, absolutely. So, what do you think the government can do to motivate SMEs to build more affordable housing?
I don't know if it's about motivation. I think there's a lot of motivation out there. It's about facilitation for me. I represented a group of 8 affordable housing developers and went to the Homes England to discuss what could be done. And there's only one left. And that's really sad, because there's such will to try and solve this problem. And the part of the problem is that viewing risk and how risk averse they are. So Homes England, for example, has a set of requirements that you need to have, but there are almost no SMEs, and there are definitely no startup SMEs who can fulfill those criteria. So that puts the risk for Homes England through the roof. And what we need to do is work as SMEs with Homes England, because they've got the skills in-house to be able to say, look, here's a plot of land, this is what I'm going to do with it. You have the skills to understand what that is. You know my background of developing. You can see that this stacks up. We can make sure that those risks go away through mutual investment. So Homes England obviously gets a return on it, and the country gets a return because the homes built, and the developers, the SMEs, get the opportunity to develop to the point where they can be independent from Homes England.
Because from my point of view, it's not as though I don't want to build affordable housing and it's got to go to an affordable housing developer. I'd like to build it as part of a scheme.
Exactly.
And I think most people would. But there's so many barriers to stop that. So where you've mentioned some of those that Homes England they don't fill the characteristics or the box ticking maybe. Have you got any examples of what those might be?
Yeah, so things like you have to have a certain amount of turnover per annum over a period of time, and also development over a period of time. And anybody knows that setting up a company takes time, and by the time you've got to that point, you haven't developed anything. So you're in a catch-22, and it can't be seen as such a simplistic way, because when you submit your CV for your career, you don't just submit the last 3 years. You submit whatever years of work you've done, and that builds to it. And that should be part of. It would be nice if they could see that as a part of the whole package, and then work with you to say, look, you want to do this sort of thing. We've got land buyers, we've got lawyers, we've got accountants, we've got funding people, we've got funds. If we work with you, and it's not that difficult, because other groups have done it. You create incubator units which allow these developers to turn up and say, look, this is my model, this is how it works. You've got the team. Let's make sure it works properly to your risk profile, and let's do it in tandem. And then once I'm going and I've got my profit back and I've got my income going through, I don't need to rely on Homes England as much, and they taper off, and then you're off and running. And then you build all the SMEs into the industry again. It
just sounds like a ridiculous excuse almost from Homes England that they're worried about you not having enough turnover, and that's their risk. There seem like there's so many things, like it's a bit like a compass contract, or they could underwrite that so that because I guess what their risk is that company goes pop. And then you just appoint a new one, or you take it over, or you look at where it's up to in the build, and you ensure that you use mechanisms to ensure that any kind of subcontractors are being paid on time and things like that. So I think there's routes.
Yes, I don't want to put Homes England down, because I think they're doing a lot of great work. It's about changing the rules that they play by, and say, look, if you set up an incubator unit, because any SME that turns up is an unknown entity. No one knows, Homes England knows anything about them. So if you can take away that unknown and de-risk it, say, look, this is the land, this is the due diligence I've done on the land, whether it's surveys, whether it's contamination tests or whatever it is, you can then go through with Homes England, and all those risk elements will peel away, and they will always have stepping rights. I mean, any funding you get is going to have stepping rights anyway. So that you just do it with a group of people who have all the skill sets, because the person lending you the money doesn't have all those skill sets. They don't have land buyers and surveyors, etc. Homes England do.
And so, what would you say the biggest traps for developers are when it comes to affordable housing?
I think for me, it's seeing affordable housing as other. Because all housing is meant to be affordable. Because if you're building something that no one can buy, what's the point? And so don't see it as other. And I think there's a lot of misconception of what affordable housing is, and the people who live in affordable housing, whether it's social rent. I think there's a lot of stigma attached to it. And I know from my own living experience that's just not true. Where I live, there are people with PhDs, there are architects, me being one of them, and I live in affordable housing. There's nurses and all sorts of people who live there. We've got an OBE and an MBE living and owning property where we live, and that's not the normal perception of what social resident housing is. And we all live very happily together with people who have trade jobs, etc., and there's no delineation in the values of, we own our homes, a lot of us, but it has no impact on that, because we have an expectation, and that's what it is. And I think we need to look at affordable housing just the same way as we see open market housing, and see it as an opportunity rather than something we have to deal with. And if we start to perceive it as that, and stop treating people in affordable housing, particularly social rent, as people who can't work in the same way as we do, we will actually start to see that actually they are, particularly during COVID lockdown, they were the key people. They were the people going out right into the coalface and dealing with the issues, because they were the nurses and they were all those sorts of people.
Because we used to have kind of, and I guess this goes on to my next question, and the question is, what have been the biggest changes over time? Because you talked about in the 40s and 50s, we had a much better approach to affordable housing because it was more funded from the government and local authorities are building. So my question is, what are the biggest changes over, I don't know, the past 40, 50 years in terms of affordable housing? Because I'm sure there used to be something around key workers and things like that. I remember growing up, my sister-in-law now, who was a key worker, got a fantastic deal on a home because of the fact that she was a key worker and things like that. So what would you say?
I think that affordable housing in the 40s and 50s was built for everybody. It wasn't just for people on low incomes. It was built for doctors and nurses and teachers and everybody, and it wasn't seen as something which was for people on lower incomes. It was seen as facilitating everybody and society, because a lot of housing was bombed and below standards. Sadly, that's moved away. I think that what we really need to be doing is looking at how we can create better quality integrated housing, whether that's affordable or not, and building and delivering that. I think that the issues for developers is to openly integrate tenure-blind affordable housing. And it doesn't, from my personal experience, it doesn't affect sales values. I did a scheme which was 80% affordable, 20% open market. The open market were valued by Savills, and they sold at Savills values. Because it was tenure blind. All the front doors were exactly the same, regardless of whether it was affordable or not. And it works.
And what were I don't know if you know this, but what were the price differences then, the sales price differences, would you say?
It had to be, the homes had to be sold at least 20% discount to market.
Right.
And as you know, in any development, you can't just blanket that of all the homes. So there are some that are less, some are, so you have an averaging out. So we had to benchmark at how much is a home worth, take off 20%, how do you work out the overall values, land value, etc., returns, and then it's maths.
Because it is hard to work out sometimes what affordable is if it goes back to, right, it's got to be 40% of someone's income, whether that's the rental price or if it's a mortgage repayment, is it that, or if it's shared equity, how much goes into that. So I think this is one of the big barriers for someone like me to do it. It's just not knowing. It's almost not knowing where to start with that. So what kind of tips would you give SME developers on that front?
Get to learn Excel spreadsheets like the back of your hand. It took me a long time to work out, and there is a lot of maths between going through the spreadsheets and what the likely mortgage offers are, because you have to work from a base minimum of a deposit, and you work from that lowest level and say.
And would it be a 20% deposit then? Would you expect?
No, because the governments have different models,
like 95% and all that.
So you can go for lower. It's harder then for people to get mortgages, and it's obviously better for them to have a bigger deposit. But you can start as a base minimum and say, well, what effect has that, and then who can afford that? And it's about going backwards and forwards on that.
Because average wages in different locations are obviously going to be different as well. And also the other thing is it done on individual income or household income? Because you get a lot of couples that will buy together and things like that.
You have to work through the whole lot. So you have to work from a single person's point of view, and then couples, etc.
Yeah, okay.
So there is a lot, and you have to. You're absolutely right. You have to do it from the local area. So you can get guidance from the local council as to what the incomes are in those local areas. ONS is a huge source of information. They produce incomes regionally as well. So you can.
Because I imagine you've got to evidence this to obviously the planning department when you go.
And if they had pro formas that allowed SME developers to say, well, actually, if you go to do this, here's a pro forma, you need to tick these boxes. It will have consequential effects on land value. It may make it more difficult, but at least everybody knows that they're working to play the same expectations. And so landowners will say, well, actually, I can't just rocket this up because I have to work to these basic rules, and we'll know what we're doing. But I've specialised in this area, so I have done a lot of that on it. It's unfair to perhaps ask other SMEs to sit and work this out. It's quite complicated.
I don't think it's so much the maths. It's just understanding where to start.
Exactly.
And I think that's.
I think performer should help.
Yeah, I think we can all do the maths or find someone that can, but it's really about working out. Oh right, that's where we start from, and actually these are the opportunities. And people might not be thinking about, well, shared equity schemes are an option, and people might not be thinking that, well, actually. It can be about your rental. You start with the mortgage payments of 95%, or you also can look at couples as well. And so it's just having all those things kind of given to you. Like you said, if you've got a pro forma or an instruction manual or something to say, well, these are the things that we're going to class as affordable, and then go from there. Because personally, I've never really got my head around those points, and it's been great to speak with you today to understand that, because my brain's kind of, the cogs are turning now, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, well, maybe I can look at that for this scheme and look at it around there.
And I think it is putting those options out, because I mean, there's shared ownership, fixed shared equity, there's all sorts of models that you can do, rental, and that's obviously a much longer term return. There's ways of working out the debts, but I think if councils actually had some of these models, or the GLA or whoever it is had these models, they were ready, and we could actually say, look, when you're doing this, there's a whole range of options for you to go. You don't have to go down this route, because if you can't get somebody to buy the social rented element, what do? You can't just then walk away from the site.
You've got to do it yourself.
Then, so if they are the mechanisms, and they're not hard to administer, because with a lot of these, it's obviously at the point of sale or rent or whatever it is that you have to look at them, and then you have to look annually or at the second round sale that the rules are being applied.
Yeah.
And that's not hard to do, because you just say, who's the buyer? Are they on X salary, deposit, etc.? Do they fill the right? Do they tick the boxes? And for, as you alluded to earlier, a lot of affordable housing, one has to market at key workers as well. So they do have, there's a list. Every council has a list as long as you're on, with people desperate for a home. It's over 1 million in London alone looking for a home. And it would resolve a lot of issues, whether it's overcrowding, etc., that we'd actually deal with it. If SMEs were armed with the right data and the right information, it would go a long way to resolving.
And where can we find that data then? Who do we ask at the council if we haven't got hold of it ourselves? Is that through the planning department itself, or is it another means?
The planning department will have that information, but I think it's about Googling who are the developers who've got these models who can maybe help you out.
Yeah,
'Cause I think for a lot of SME affordable housing developers, they want to go in tandem with a seasoned developer and say, well, I'll help you with that element. And we can work out an arrangement where if I help you with that element, I get X out of it.
Because it does
So
seem
it's a shared
it does seem a bit crazy that the council's not kind of putting that out there for us to go, okay, great, let's have a win-win situation here.
The information is on the GLA website. That the mayor does talk about what affordable housing is and how it works, but it's getting down to the numbers and the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, which I think is
very helpful.
And obviously, like you say, there's a stigma to it as well from like the amount of kind of SME developers I speak to that go, oh, I'm not going for that scheme because it's over the threshold and things like that. And where you said, well, actually, what we did is we redid the scheme, and instead of 9 units, we put 18 on and things like that. So I think there's lots of things that people kind of, they cut their nose off to spite the face in these things, and that's purely because they haven't got all the information there.
So lack of understanding and you say lack of information. I think if people got to understand all the options available, I think that a lot more SMEs would go, actually, I could do that, because all I have to do is fill out this form, make sure the buyer fills that criteria, and I'm away.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's been absolutely fantastic, Peter. Is there anything else you want the audience to know about affordable housing or yourself?
Well, not about myself, but no, not really. I think there is a lot of work to be done to resolve the housing crisis, and I think for me, the primary thing is to look at it as a long-term proposition, and to make sure that when we are developing homes, we consider opportunity and delight. It's often development is such a hard task to do. We forget that this is going to be somebody's home, and we need to approach it from that perspective, saying, I'm going to make sure that whatever this home is, somebody's going to go home after a long shift at work, and when they get home, as they approach the building, there must be a smile on their face and have that positivity for it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Peter. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
Cheers.